In the final days of summer, 1335 before Christ, a young scribe named Khemwaset made a discovery that would cost him his life. Deep within the royal archives of Amarna, surrounded by towering papyrus scrolls and the suffocating heat of the Egyptian sun, he uncovered documents that revealed the most dangerous secret in the kingdom. The pharaoh Akhenaten, branded as a heretic by his enemies, was not the madman history would remember him as. He was a ruler desperately fighting to save Egypt from a conspiracy that reached into the very heart of the most sacred temples. As Khemwaset read through the hidden papyri by flickering oil lamplight, his hands trembling with each revelation, he realized he held proof that the powerful priests of Amun had been systematically destroying Egypt from within. But knowledge this explosive came with a price. Within days of his discovery, Khemwaset would vanish without a trace, his body destined to remain hidden for decades until workers renovating the abandoned palace would make a chilling find. Before we uncover the fate of this brave scribe and the shocking truth he died protecting, tell me in the comments where in the world you are listening from. And don't forget to subscribe to join our journey through the darkest secrets of ancient Egypt. Now, let us travel back to the golden city of Amarna, where power, religion, and conspiracy would collide in ways that would reshape an empire. The year 1350 before Christ marked the height of Egyptian power under the 18th dynasty, yet beneath the surface of this golden age, cracks were beginning to show. In the newly constructed capital of Amarna, built by the pharaoh Akhenaten in honor of his revolutionary god Aten, life moved to a rhythm unlike anywhere else in Egypt. The city rose from the eastern bank of the Nile like a jewel, its limestone temples gleaming white under the relentless sun, its broad avenues filled with the constant bustle of workers, scribes, and foreign diplomats. Khemwaset had arrived in Amarna 3 years earlier, a promising young man from Memphis whose skill with hieroglyphs and hieratic script had earned him a coveted position in the royal archives. At 25, he was considered one of the most talented record-keepers of his generation, trusted with organizing the most sensitive documents of the kingdom. His days began before dawn, when the desert air still held a whisper of coolness, and stretched long into the night as he carefully catalogued diplomatic correspondence, religious decrees, and administrative orders that kept the vast Egyptian empire functioning. The royal archives occupied an entire wing of the great palace, a maze of chambers filled floor to ceiling with papyrus rolls, wooden tablets, and leather scrolls. The air was thick with the scent of ink, papyrus fiber, and the cedar oil used to preserve the most important documents. Scribes moved through these corridors like priests in a temple, their voices hushed, their movements careful and deliberate. Every document was sacred, every word carried the weight of divine pharaonic authority. But Amarna was a city unlike any other in Egyptian history. Here, the traditional gods that had protected Egypt for thousands of years were forbidden. No longer did the people pray to Amun-Ra, the king of gods, or offer tribute to Ptah, the creator. Instead, all worship was directed toward Aten, the solar disk, whose rays reached down like hands to bless the royal family. The temples of Amarna were open to the sky, their altars piled high with bread, beer, flowers, and roasted fowl, all offered to the life-giving sun. The common people of Amarna struggled with this religious revolution. In whispered conversations in the markets, where vendors sold fresh fish from the Nile, pottery from the local workshops, and grain from the royal granaries, citizens spoke of their confusion and fear. The old gods had protected their families for generations. What would happen to their souls in the afterlife if they abandoned Osiris, the Lord of the Dead? Would their crops fail if they no longer honored the ancient fertility gods? Among the palace servants, tension was even more pronounced. Many had been transferred from Thebes, the old capital, where the great temple of Amun-Ra dominated the city skyline. These men and women had grown up in the shadow of traditional religion, their fathers and grandfathers serving the established priesthood. Now they found themselves in a strange new world, where everything they had believed was turned upside down. Khaimwaset had adapted better than most to life in Amarna. His scholarly nature allowed him to appreciate the intellectual sophistication of Akhenaten's religious philosophy, while his position in the archives gave him unique insight into the workings of this revolutionary kingdom. He had access to correspondence between Akhenaten and foreign rulers, diplomatic treaties, and the detailed records of temple offerings that kept the new religion functioning. Yet as the summer of 1335 approached, strange signs began to appear throughout the kingdom. Grain shipments from the provinces were arriving late or not at all. Reports filtered in from the borders of increased Hittite military activity. Most troubling of all, several high-ranking officials had quietly departed Amarna, claiming urgent business in their home cities but never returning. The atmosphere in the royal archives grew tense, with senior scribes exchanging worried glances over their papyrus rolls and speaking in voices barely above a whisper. It was in this climate of growing unease that Khaimwaset would make the discovery that would seal his fate, uncovering a conspiracy that reached back years before Akhenaten's reign and forward into a future that would see the systematic destruction of everything the pharaoh had tried to build. The discovery came on a suffocating evening in late Pharaoh, when the Nile's flood had receded and the fields around Amarna baked under an unforgiving sun. Khaimwaset was working alone in the deepest section of the archives, reorganizing documents that had been hastily stored during the early years of Amarna's construction. The oil lamps cast dancing shadows on the limestone walls, and the silence was broken only by the scratch of his reed pen and the occasional scurrying of mice through the papyrus stacks. He was examining a collection of sealed jars containing documents from Akhenaten's father, Amenhotep III, when his fingers detected something unusual. One of the clay seals had been broken and carefully resealed, the wax bearing impressions that didn't match the original royal cartouche. Curious, Khaimwaset carefully opened the jar and withdrew a bundle of papyri wrapped in fine linen. What he found inside made his heart race with a mixture of excitement and terror. The documents were correspondence between high-ranking priests of Amun and provincial governors, dating back 10 years before Akhenaten's religious revolution. But these were not ordinary temple letters discussing festivals or offerings. They were detailed plans for undermining royal authority, diverting tax revenues, and coordinating resistance to pharaonic decrees. The first papyrus he unrolled contained a message from Amenemheb, the second prophet of Amun at Karnak, to the governor of Elephantine. The hieratic script was elegant, but the content was explosive. The young prince grows too interested in matters that should remain with the gods. His father listens too closely to his counsel regarding temple revenues. We must take steps to ensure the traditional order remains unchanged, even if it requires extreme measures. Khaimwaset's hands trembled as he continued reading. Document after document revealed a systematic campaign by the Amun priesthood to weaken the pharaonic government. They had been intercepting grain shipments destined for royal granaries, redirecting them to temple storehouses. They had convinced local governors to underreport tax collections, keeping the excess for themselves while claiming the provinces were suffering from poor harvests. Most shocking of all, they had been in communication with Egypt's enemies, providing information about military deployments and defensive preparations. One papyrus contained a message that made Khaimwaset's blood turn to ice water in his veins. It was addressed to Suppiluliuma, the king of the Hittites, Egypt's greatest rival. The message, written in the careful hand of a high-ranking Egyptian official, provided detailed information about troop movements along the northern frontier and suggested the best times for Hittite raids, when Egyptian defenses would be weakest. But the most damning document was a letter dated just 2 years before Akhenaten's accession to the throne. It outlined a plan to eliminate the young prince before he could implement the religious and administrative reforms that threatened the priest's power. The letter spoke of accidents that could befall a pharaoh, of illnesses that might strike at opportune moments, of the divine will that sometimes required mortal intervention. As Khaimwaset read these treasonous words, he realized the truth about Akhenaten's religious revolution. It had not been the mad inspiration of a heretic pharaoh, as his enemies claimed. It had been a desperate attempt to break the power of a priestly conspiracy that was slowly strangling Egypt from within. By establishing a new religion with himself as its sole earthly representative, Akhenaten had tried to cut the Amun priests off from their source of power and wealth. The documents explained so much that had puzzled historians and scribes. Why had Akhenaten moved the capital from Thebes to Amarna? Because Thebes was the stronghold of the Amun priesthood, where their influence was too deep to root out. Why had he forbidden the worship of the traditional gods? Because the temples were being used as centers of resistance against royal authority. Why had he promoted officials from outside the traditional elite? Because the old aristocracy was compromised by their connections to the treasonous priests. But as Khayem-Waset absorbed the implications of his discovery, he heard footsteps in the corridor outside, heavy sandals on stone, moving with purpose toward the archive chambers. He quickly rewrapped the papyri and sealed them back in their jar, his mind racing with plans. These documents were proof that could vindicate Akhenaten's memory and expose the true enemies of Egypt. But they were also evidence that could get him killed if the wrong people learned of their existence. The footsteps stopped outside his door. In the flickering lamplight, Khayem-Waset saw the shadow of a figure pause in the doorway. His heart hammered against his ribs as he pretended to work on routine administrative documents, forcing his breathing to remain steady and his hands to stop shaking. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps moved on. But Khayem-Waset knew his time was running out. Someone suspected what he had found, and the same forces that had tried to destroy Akhenaten would not hesitate to eliminate one inconvenient scribe. In the days following his discovery, Khayem-Waset found himself trapped in a nightmare of paranoia and fear. Every glance from a fellow scribe seemed suspicious. Every conversation in the corridors might be about him. Every shadow could conceal an assassin sent by the conspiracy he had uncovered. The treasonous documents remained hidden in their sealed jar, but the knowledge they contained burned in his mind like a fever he could not shake. He began to notice things that had escaped his attention before. Certain senior scribes would fall silent when he approached, their conversations resuming only after he had passed. Messages arrived at the archives that were immediately taken to private chambers, never to be catalogued with the official records. Most disturbing of all, he observed that several documents he had previously handled were no longer in their designated locations, as if someone was systematically removing evidence from the royal archives. The weight of his discovery pressed down on him like the massive stone blocks of the pyramids. During the long, hot afternoons, when the desert wind filled the air with stinging sand, he would stare out at the gleaming temples of Aten and wonder if Akhenaten himself had known the full extent of the conspiracy against him. Had the pharaoh died natural death, as the official records claimed? Or had the Amun priests finally succeeded in their plans for divine intervention? Khayem-Waset tried to confide in his closest colleague, an older scribe named Ptah-Hotep, who had served in the archives since the early days of Amarna. But when he began to hint at his discoveries, carefully probing to see if Ptah-Hotep might be trusted with such dangerous knowledge, the older man's face went pale as limestone. Ptah-Hotep pulled him aside into an empty storage chamber, his voice barely above a whisper. "Young friend," Ptah-Hotep said, his eyes darting nervously toward the doorway. "There are certain subjects that wise men do not discuss, even in private. The gods have their own justice, and mortals who interfere in their affairs often find themselves facing unfortunate accidents. Promise me you will focus on your assigned duties and leave ancient mysteries buried where they belong." The warning was clear, but it also confirmed Khayem-Waset's suspicions. Ptah-Hotep knew something about the conspiracy, perhaps had even been aware of it for years. The corruption and treason were not ancient history buried in dusty papyri. They were ongoing, present dangers that continued to threaten the stability of Egypt even after Akhenaten's death. That night, as Khayem-Waset lay on his sleeping mat in the small apartment provided for junior scribes, he made a decision that would determine his fate. He could not remain silent about what he had discovered. The evidence he possessed could expose the true enemies of Egypt and vindicate the memory of a pharaoh who had been systematically slandered by his murderers. But he also knew that acting rashly would ensure his own destruction before the truth could be revealed. He developed a careful plan. First, he would make copies of the most damning documents, hiding them in locations throughout Amarna where they might survive even if he did not. Then he would attempt to contact loyal officials who might be trusted with such explosive information. Finally, if necessary, he would try to get word to the young pharaoh Tutankhaten, who had recently changed his name to Tutankhamun in apparent submission to the restored Amun priesthood, but who might still harbor loyalty to his predecessor's memory. Working by lamplight in the pre-dawn hours, when the archives were deserted and even the guards dozed at their posts, Khemwaset began the dangerous process of copying the treasonous correspondence. His practiced hand moved swiftly across fresh papyrus, reproducing the hieratic characters that condemned the Amun priests as traitors and conspirators. Each document he copied brought him closer to completing his mission, but also increased the risk of discovery. As he worked, Khemwaset reflected on the tragic irony of Akhenaten's fate. The pharaoh had been branded a heretic for abandoning the traditional gods, but in reality, he had been trying to save Egypt from priests who were themselves betraying everything the gods supposedly stood for. The Amun clergy, who claimed to speak for the king of the gods, had been enriching themselves at Egypt's expense, weakening the kingdom's defenses, and even collaborating with foreign enemies. The evidence suggested that Akhenaten's religious revolution had been working. The provinces that had embraced the Aten cult remained loyal to the crown, their taxes flowing to royal treasuries rather than temple coffers. The new administrative system, staffed by officials chosen for competence rather than family connections, had been more efficient than the corrupt networks it replaced. But the conspiracy had deep roots and powerful allies, and when Akhenaten died unexpectedly in his 17th year of rule, the old order had quickly reasserted itself. Now, as Egypt returned to the traditional ways under the restored Amun priesthood, Khemwaset realized he might be the only person alive who knew the full truth about the conspiracy. The burden of that knowledge was overwhelming, but so was the responsibility it carried. If he failed to act, the traitors who had destroyed Akhenaten would continue to weaken Egypt until the kingdom fell to its enemies. The evidence he had discovered was not just historical curiosity, it was a matter of national survival. As the month of Shemu arrived and the annual flood approached, Khemwaset put his desperate plan into motion. He had spent weeks creating detailed copies of the most incriminating documents, writing in a careful hand that disguised his distinctive scribal style. These copies he hid in 5 different locations throughout Amarna. Sealed in a jar buried beneath the floor stones of an abandoned workshop, wrapped in oiled leather and concealed within the walls of a storage building, and hidden in 3 separate chambers of the vast palace complex. His first attempt to find allies nearly ended in disaster. He approached Mahu, the chief of police in Amarna, hoping that the man's position would make him a natural enemy of the conspiracy. But when Khemwaset began to hint at corruption within the priestly establishment, Mahu's reaction was swift and violent. The police chief grabbed him by the shoulders, his fingers digging painfully into Khemwaset's flesh. "Boy," Mahu hissed, his breath hot with beer and anger, "you will speak no more of such matters. There are ears everywhere in this city, and tongues that wag too freely sometimes find themselves cut from their owners' heads. Return to your scrolls and your ink, and forget whatever foolish notions have entered your mind." The encounter left Khemwaset shaken but more determined than ever. Mahu's violent reaction suggested that the conspiracy extended beyond the Amun priesthood into the very security apparatus of the state. Who could he trust if even the chief of police was compromised? The young scribe began to understand the full scope of the challenge that had faced Akhenaten. The pharaoh had not been fighting a simple religious dispute, but a vast network of corruption that included priests, officials, and military commanders. His second attempt proved more promising, but ultimately more dangerous. Among the foreign correspondence that passed through the archives were letters from Syrian and Nubian governors, local officials appointed by Egypt to maintain control over the empire's provinces. One name appeared repeatedly in dispatches praising the efficiency and loyalty of local administrators, Amenemhab, a general stationed in the fortress city of Buhan, far to the south in Nubia. Khaimwaset crafted a carefully worded message to General Amenemhab, using the formal diplomatic language that concealed dangerous ideas beneath layers of protocol and courtesy. He wrote of his concerns about irregularities in the historical record, and his desire to ensure that the true glory of the pharaohs was preserved for future generations. If Amenemhab was truly loyal to Egypt rather than to the conspiracy, he would understand the coded language and respond appropriately. The reply came back within weeks, carried by a trusted messenger who had made the dangerous journey north from Nubia. Amenemhab's letter was brief but electrifying. Young scribe, your concerns about preserving true history are shared by many who serve Egypt's glory. There are those of us who remember the real reasons behind the great changes of recent years. If you possess knowledge that could restore honor to a defamed pharaoh, know that you have allies in distant places who await the proper time to act. For the first time since making his discovery, Khaimwaset felt a surge of hope. But his elation was short-lived. The next morning, as he arrived at the archives for his daily duties, he found his workspace had been searched. Documents he had carefully arranged were slightly out of order. Inkwells had been moved, and his personal writing materials showed signs of examination. Someone had been through his belongings with professional skill, looking for evidence of his activities. Worse still, he noticed that Ptahhotep, his fellow scribe and the man who had warned him to remain silent, was watching him with barely concealed anxiety. Throughout the day, the older man found excuses to observe Khaimwaset's work, appearing suddenly in corridors where he had no business, lingering near doorways where he could monitor conversations. By evening, Khaimwaset realized with growing horror that Ptahhotep was reporting on his activities to someone else. That night, unable to sleep for fear and stress, Khaimwaset made a decision that would prove to be his last mistake. He decided to confront Ptahhotep directly, hoping that their years of friendship might persuade the older scribe to abandon whatever hold the conspiracy had over him. As the palace settled into sleep and the guards began their midnight rounds, he made his way through the darkened corridors to Ptahhotep's quarters. He found the older man awake, sitting on his sleeping mat with his head in his hands, the picture of misery and guilt. When Khaimwaset whispered his name, Ptahhotep looked up with tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "I know why you have come," Ptahhotep said, his voice cracking with emotion. "You have discovered the old documents, the ones from the time before the religious changes. I have been watching you, reporting on your activities because they threatened to have my entire family killed if I refused. My son serves as a temple guard in Thebes. My daughter is married to a merchant whose business depends on priestly favor. They own my loyalty through the lives of those I love most." Khaimwaset sat beside his colleague, feeling the weight of tragedy settling over them both. The documents prove that Akhenaten was trying to save Egypt, not destroy it. He whispered urgently. "The Amun priests were stealing from the treasury, weakening our defenses, even collaborating with the Hittites. If we do nothing, they will eventually destroy the kingdom they claim to serve." Ptahhotep nodded slowly. "I suspected as much. There were too many convenient famines, too many military disasters that seemed to benefit our enemies more than they hurt them. But knowing the truth and acting upon it are different things entirely. The conspiracy you have uncovered reaches into every temple, every government office, every military garrison. They have spent decades placing their people in positions of power, and now they control the kingdom more completely than any pharaoh ever did." The two men sat in silence for long moments, contemplating the hopelessness of their situation. Finally, Ptahhotep spoke again, his voice barely audible in the darkness. "There is one chance, but it is desperate beyond measure. Tomorrow, A delegation from Thebes arrives to inspect the archives and select documents for transfer back to the old capital. Among them will be Amenhotep, the son of Hapu, advisor to the current pharaoh. He is old and wise, and some say he privately questioned the rush to abandon Akhenaten's reforms. If anyone in the current government might listen to evidence of the conspiracy, it would be him. It was their only hope. But as the two scribes made their plans to approach the visiting dignitary, neither of them noticed the shadow that detached itself from the wall outside Ptahhotep's door and slipped silently away into the darkness. Their conversation had been overheard, and by morning the conspiracy would know exactly what evidence had been discovered and who posed a threat to their carefully constructed version of history. The delegation from Thebes arrived with the dawn, their retinue impressive enough to demonstrate the restored power of the old capital. 12 officials in pristine white linen, accompanied by twice as many servants and guards, swept through the gates of Amarna like a conquering army, claiming victory over a defeated enemy. At their head walked Amenhotep, son of Hapu, a man whose reputation for wisdom and integrity had survived 4 different pharaohs and countless political upheavals. Khemwaset watched the procession from the windows of the archive building, his heart pounding with nervous anticipation. Everything depended on the next few hours. If he could convince this powerful advisor to examine the evidence he had discovered, there might still be hope of exposing the conspiracy that had destroyed Akhenaten and continued to threaten Egypt. But if he misjudged the old man's loyalties, or if the conspiracy had already corrupted even this legendary figure, then his own death was certain. Ptahhotep appeared at his shoulder, pale and trembling with fear. "I have reconsidered our plan," the older scribe whispered urgently. "The risks are too great. If we are wrong about Amenhotep's loyalties, we will not live to see another sunrise. Perhaps it would be better to destroy the documents and pretend we never found them." But Khemwaset had moved beyond such calculations of personal safety. The evidence he possessed was too important to Egypt's future to be buried out of cowardice. "If we do nothing," he replied, his voice steady despite his fear, "then Akhenaten's murderers will have won completely. They will continue to weaken Egypt from within until our enemies destroy us entirely. I would rather die trying to save the kingdom than live knowing I could have acted, but chose comfort over duty." The morning passed with agonizing slowness as the delegation toured various sections of the palace complex, inspecting facilities and meeting with current officials. Khemwaset used his position in the archives to track their movements, waiting for the moment when he might approach Amenhotep privately. But the old advisor was never alone, constantly surrounded by his retinue and the Amarna officials eager to impress their important visitors. Finally, as the afternoon heat reached its peak and most of the delegation retired to shaded chambers for rest and refreshment, Khemwaset saw his chance. Amenhotep had separated from the main group to examine some of the architectural innovations of Amarna's temples, walking slowly through the open-air courtyards with only 2 guards for protection. The young scribe waited until the old man paused in a secluded alcove to study a wall relief, then approached with his heart hammering against his ribs. "Noble Amenhotep," he said, bowing deeply and speaking in the formal court language that showed proper respect. "I am Khemwaset, keeper of royal archives. Might I have the honor of a brief word regarding historical preservation?" The old man turned, his weathered face creased with the wisdom of decades spent in service to the crown. His eyes, though dimmed with age, retained the sharp intelligence that had made him legendary among Egyptian administrators. "Speak, young scribe," he said kindly. "What concerns you about historical preservation?" Khemwaset glanced nervously at the guards, but Amenhotep gestured for them to step back out of hearing range. Taking a deep breath, the young scribe launched into his carefully prepared speech. "Honored sir, in my duties organizing the archives, I have discovered documents that cast doubt upon the official accounts of recent events. papers that suggest the religious changes implemented by the previous pharaoh were not the actions of a heretic, but defensive measures against threats to the kingdom. Amenhotep's expression grew grave. "These are dangerous words, young man. The current pharaoh and his advisors have made clear that the previous reign was a time of error that has been corrected. To question this judgment could be seen as treasonous. But what if the judgment itself was based on lies?" Khaemwaset pressed desperately. "What if those who condemned the previous pharaoh as a heretic were themselves the true enemies of Egypt? I have found correspondence proving that certain priests were stealing from royal treasuries, undermining military operations, and even providing information to Egypt's enemies." The old advisor was silent for long moments, his face revealing nothing of his thoughts. Finally, he spoke in a voice so quiet that Khaemwaset had to lean forward to hear him. "If such evidence exists, it would indeed change everything we thought we knew about recent history, but it would also be incredibly dangerous to possess. Those who benefited from the current version of events would stop at nothing to suppress such revelations." "Then you believe me?" Khaemwaset asked hopefully. "You will examine the evidence?" Amenhotep looked around carefully, ensuring they were still unobserved. "Show me one document," he said finally. "One piece of evidence that proves your claims. If it is genuine and as damning as you suggest, then we will discuss how to proceed. But know that by doing this, you are placing both our lives in mortal danger." Khaemwaset nodded eagerly and led the old advisor to a nearby storage chamber where he had hidden one of his most carefully copied documents. It was a letter from a high-ranking priest of Amun to a Hittite commander, providing detailed information about Egyptian troop movements and suggesting the best targets for raids. As Amenhotep read the treasonous correspondence, his face grew darker with each line. "By the gods," he whispered when he finished reading. "If this is authentic, it proves that the Amun priesthood was actively collaborating with Egypt's enemies while publicly claiming to serve the divine order. No wonder Akhenaten felt compelled to establish a new religious system. He was fighting for the kingdom's very survival." But as the two men discussed the implications of the document, neither noticed that they were being watched. From a concealed position behind a decorative column, a figure in the robes of a minor temple official observed their meeting with growing alarm. The watcher was Katie, a spy planted in the delegation by the very conspiracy Khaemwaset sought to expose. His mission was to identify and eliminate any remaining evidence of the priesthood's treasonous activities. As Amenhotep and Khaemwaset made plans to examine more of the hidden documents, Katie slipped away to send an urgent message to his handlers in Thebes. The message was brief but explicit. "The archived evidence has been discovered. The scribe and the old advisor must be silenced before they can act. Implement final protocols immediately." By evening, as shadows lengthened across the courtyards of Amarna and the delegation prepared for their formal banquet with local officials, the conspiracy's response was already in motion. Assassins moved through the palace corridors like deadly shadows, and Khaemwaset's time was running out faster than sand through an hourglass. The young scribe who had dared to challenge the most powerful conspiracy in Egyptian history was about to discover that knowledge, no matter how important, could not protect him from the reach of those who had already murdered a pharaoh. The attack came in the darkest hour before dawn, when even the palace guards dozed at their posts, and the corridors lay shrouded in silence, broken only by the distant barking of jackals in the desert. Khaemwaset had spent a sleepless night in his quarters, his mind racing with plans for the next day when he and Amenhotep would examine the complete collection of evidence against the conspiracy. He had finally allowed himself to hope that justice might prevail, that the truth about Akhenaten's heroic struggle against corruption might be revealed to the world. The soft scrape of sandals on stone in the corridor outside his door brought him instantly alert. These were not the heavy footsteps of the regular guards making their rounds, but the careful, deliberate movements of men trained in stealth. Khaemwaset's mouth went dry as he realized that the conspiracy had finally moved against him. There was no time to reach the documents he had hidden. No chance to warn Amenhotep or send word to General Amenemhab in distant Nubia. The door to his chambers opened silently, and 3 figures entered like shadows given human form. In the faint starlight filtering through the window, Khaemwaset could see they wore the simple robes of temple servants, but their movements revealed military training. The leader carried a curved bronze dagger that gleamed wickedly in the darkness, while his companions bore lengths of rope that could only serve one purpose. Khaemwaset, son of Amentet. The leader spoke in a voice devoid of emotion. You have been judged guilty of crimes against the divine order. Your sentence is death, but first you will reveal the locations of all treasonous documents in your possession. The young scribe pressed himself against the wall, his mind working frantically for some means of escape. But the chamber was small, and the assassins blocked the only exit. His years of scholarly training had not prepared him for physical combat, and he knew that resistance would only prolong his agony. Yet even facing death, his thoughts turned not to his own fate, but to the evidence that must survive him. I will tell you nothing, he said, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. The truth about your conspiracy will be revealed, whether I live or die. The leader of the assassins smiled coldly. Your defiance is admirable but pointless. We already know of your hidden documents in the workshop, the storage building, and 3 locations within the palace. Our agents have been watching you for weeks, cataloging every move you made. Even now, our people are retrieving and destroying every piece of evidence you so carefully preserved. Khaemwaset felt his heart sink as he realized the full extent of his failure. The conspiracy had anticipated his every move, turning his own careful precautions against him. But then the assassin's next words revealed an unexpected glimmer of hope. However, the man continued, we know you made copies of some documents and shared information with the old advisor Amenhotep. Before you die, you will tell us exactly what evidence he has seen and where any remaining copies might be hidden. So they did not have everything. Amenhotep still possessed one crucial document, and there might yet be other pieces of evidence beyond the conspiracy's reach. Khaemwaset realized that his death could serve a purpose if he could protect what remained of the proof against the priesthood's treason. Amenhotep knows nothing. He lied desperately. I showed him only routine administrative documents. There are no other copies beyond those you claim to have found. The assassin's smile widened. Your loyalty to your accomplice is touching, but misguided. We will extract the truth from you one way or another. The only question is how much pain you wish to endure first. But before the interrogation could begin, shouts erupted in the corridor outside. The sound of running footsteps and clashing bronze weapons echoed through the palace as some kind of disturbance broke out nearby. The assassins turned toward the door in alarm, their carefully planned operation suddenly complicated by unexpected chaos. Through his window, Khaemwaset could see flames beginning to flicker in one of the palace outbuildings. The shouts were growing louder, and he could make out the voice of Mahu, the chief of police, barking orders to his men. Whatever was happening, it had drawn attention away from his quarters at the crucial moment. The leader of the assassins cursed under his breath and gestured to his companions. Make it quick, he hissed. We cannot risk being discovered here. As the bronze dagger rose toward his throat, Khaemwaset closed his eyes and whispered a final prayer to whatever gods might be listening. But instead of the sharp bite of metal through flesh, he heard the wet thud of a weapon striking home and a strangled cry of pain. Opening his eyes, he saw one of the assassins collapsing to the floor with a spear protruding from his back. In the doorway stood Amenhotep, flanked by 2 Nubian guards whose dark skin marked them as men from the far south. These were not part of the official delegation from Thebes, but soldiers loyal to General Amenemhab, who had arrived secretly in response to Khaemwaset's message. The old advisor suspected treachery when temple servants began asking too many questions about his private conversations. One of the Nubians explained, as his companion finished off the remaining assassins with swift, professional efficiency. We have been watching the Watchers, and when we saw armed men entering your quarters, we knew the time for subtlety had passed. Amenhotep helped Kayemwaset to his feet, his aged hands surprisingly strong. "The fire in the outbuilding was our doing," he explained quickly. "A distraction to draw attention while we dealt with your would-be killers. But we have little time before more enemies arrive." The conspiracy reaches deeper into the palace hierarchy than we imagined. As if to confirm his words, the sound of marching feet echoed through the corridors. Not the confused running of guards responding to an emergency, but the disciplined march of soldiers moving with deadly purpose toward their location. The conspiracy had committed significant resources to silencing Kayemwaset and recovering the evidence, suggesting that the threat to their power was even greater than the young scribe had realized. "We must reach the documents you showed me," Amenhotep said urgently. "If we can preserve even that single piece of evidence, we may still have a chance to expose the truth." But as they moved through the palace corridors, avoiding the main passages where hostile forces might be waiting, Kayemwaset realized the full scope of the disaster that had befallen his mission. Smoke was rising from multiple locations throughout Amarna, indicating that the conspiracy was systematically destroying not just his hidden documents, but any records that might implicate them in treason. The royal archives themselves were burning, millennia of Egyptian history going up in flames to protect the guilty. They reached the storage chamber where Amenhotep had first examined the evidence of priestly collaboration with Egypt's enemies, only to find it already ransacked. The walls had been torn apart, floor stones pried up, and every possible hiding place searched and emptied. The treasonous letter that had proven the Amun priesthood's guilt was gone, along with any hope of using it to vindicate Akhenaten's memory. "It is finished," Kayemwaset said, his voice hollow with despair. "They have destroyed everything. The conspiracy has won, and the truth will die with us." But Amenhotep gripped his shoulder firmly. "Not everything is lost," the old advisor said with grim determination. "I memorized every word of that letter, and there are still loyal men in distant provinces who remember the real reasons behind Akhenaten's reforms. General Amenemhab commands respect throughout Nubia, and there are others who served the kingdom before the corruption took hold. The evidence may be gone, but the knowledge survives in living minds." One of the Nubian guards interrupted their conversation with urgent whispers. "More soldiers approaching from the east wing. Temple guards, not palace security. They will show no mercy to anyone found here." The small group moved quickly through lesser-known passages that servants used to navigate the vast palace complex. As they fled deeper into the building's interior, Kayemwaset caught glimpses through windows of the systematic destruction taking place throughout Amarna. Buildings that had housed administrative records were ablaze. Workshops where royal decrees were copied and distributed were being torn apart by organized teams of workers, and even some of the smaller temples dedicated to Aten were being vandalized. The conspiracy was not merely covering up evidence of their past crimes. They were erasing Akhenaten's entire legacy, ensuring that future generations would know only the version of history written by his enemies. The pharaoh who had tried to save Egypt from internal corruption would be remembered only as a mad heretic who had threatened the kingdom's ancient traditions. They reached a narrow stairway that led to the palace's upper levels, where private chambers for visiting dignitaries offered temporary refuge. But as they climbed the stone steps, the sound of pursuit grew closer. Heavy footsteps and shouted orders echoed through the corridors behind them, suggesting that their escape route had been discovered. At the top of the stairs, Amenhotep turned to face his young companion. "There is one last hope," he said quietly. "Among my personal effects is a message prepared for General Amenemhab, detailing everything we have discovered. If one of us can reach the harbor before dawn, there is a ship departing for Nubia that could carry word south to loyal forces." Kayemwaset understood the implication immediately. Someone would have to remain behind to delay their pursuers, sacrificing himself so that the truth might survive. Without hesitation, he stepped forward. "I will hold them here while you escape. The knowledge you carry is too important to risk." The old advisor shook his head. My years are nearly spent, while yours stretch ahead like the Nile at flood time. You must be the one to survive, to ensure that someday, when the kingdom is ready, Akhenaten's true story can be told. But before either could implement their desperate plan, the decision was taken from them. Temple guards burst through the doorway at the base of the stairs, their bronze-tipped spears gleaming in the lamplight. The Nubian soldiers moved to meet them, their own weapons singing through the air as they fought to protect their charges. But they were outnumbered 3-1, and though they fought with the skill of professional warriors, the outcome was inevitable. As the last of the loyal guards fell, pierced by multiple spear thrusts, Akhenaten found himself face to face with the leader of their pursuers. The man wore the golden collar of a high-ranking priest, his shaved head marked with the sacred tattoos that indicated service to Amun-Ra. His smile was cold and triumphant as he surveyed the scene of carnage. So ends the last foolish attempt to resurrect a heretic's lies, the priest said with satisfaction. The divine order has been restored, and Egypt will forget this brief madness that threatened our sacred traditions. Amenhotep, bleeding from a wound in his side but still defiant, spat at the priest's feet. You speak of divine order while murdering loyal servants of Egypt. Your God would be ashamed of the crimes committed in his name. The priest's smile widened. My God understands that sometimes blood must be shed to preserve the greater good. Akhenaten's heresy would have destroyed the kingdom if we had not acted to stop him. His death, like yours, serves the highest purpose. And there it was, the confession that Akhenaten had longed to hear, but would never live to use. The conspiracy had indeed murdered Akhenaten, just as the hidden documents had suggested. The pharaoh's natural death had been an assassination, carried out by the very priests who now claimed to serve Egypt's best interests, while systematically weakening the kingdom for their own benefit. As the priest raised his ceremonial dagger for the killing blow, Akhenaten felt a strange sense of peace. He had failed to save the evidence that could have vindicated Akhenaten, but he had succeeded in uncovering the truth. Even if that truth died with him, he had served his pharaoh and his kingdom with honor. The knowledge that Akhenaten had been a hero rather than a heretic was worth dying for. But death, when it came, was not the swift end he expected. Instead of the dagger's sharp bite, he felt rough hands seizing him and binding his arms with coarse rope. The priest had decided that a quick execution was insufficient punishment for the crime of threatening the conspiracy's carefully constructed lies. This one will serve as an example, the priest declared coldly. He will be sealed alive in the deepest chambers beneath the palace, along with any remaining evidence of his treasonous research. Future generations will find his body as a warning of what happens to those who challenge the divine order. As consciousness faded under the impact of a bronze club, Akhenaten's last coherent thought was a prayer that somehow, someday, the truth would surface despite all efforts to bury it. The brave scribe who had dared to challenge the most powerful conspiracy in Egypt was about to become part of the very mystery he had tried to solve. His body destined to lie hidden for decades until chance would finally reveal both his fate and the explosive secrets he died protecting. 27 years passed like the annual floods of the Nile, each season washing away more memories of the turbulent times that had shaken Egypt to its foundations. The great city of Amarna had become a ghost of its former glory, its broad avenues now filled with drifting sand instead of bustling crowds. The temples of Aten stood empty, their open courtyards haunted only by the cries of desert birds and the whisper of wind through crumbling limestone. Most of the palace complex had been stripped of its valuable materials, the gold and silver relocated to Thebes, along with anything else that could demonstrate the restored power of the traditional priesthood. Yet a small garrison of workers remained, tasked with maintaining the structural integrity of the buildings that had not been completely abandoned. Among them was Seneb, a master mason whose weathered hands had helped build Amarna's foundations during the reign of the heretic pharaoh. Seneb remembered those early days with a mixture of pride and sorrow. He had been young then, filled with excitement at participating in the construction of a revolutionary capital. The workers had believed they were building something eternal, a city that would stand as a testament to divine truth for thousands of years. Now, as he supervised repairs to prevent the desert from reclaiming what remained, he wondered if their efforts had been nothing more than the fevered dreams of a mad king. It was during the bitter cold of Pharaoh season, when the Nile ran low, and the desert wind cut through even the thickest robes, that Seneb's crew made their fateful discovery. They had been reinforcing the foundation walls of the main palace complex, areas that had been hastily sealed during the chaotic evacuation decades earlier. The winter rains, rare but devastating when they came, had caused some of the older stonework to shift and crack. As his workers removed loose stones from a section of wall that seemed to have been built in obvious haste, one of them called out in alarm. Behind the barrier lay not empty space, as they had expected, but a small chamber that exhaled the stale breath of long confinement. The smell that emerged made the workers step back in revulsion. Not the clean scent of ancient stone, but the unmistakable odor of death mixed with something else, something that spoke of desperation and fear. Seneb ordered torches brought forward, and as the flickering light penetrated the darkness, he felt his blood turn cold in his veins. On the floor of the chamber lay what had once been a young man, his body preserved by the dry desert air into a leathery husk. But what made the discovery truly horrifying was not just the presence of the corpse, but the way it had been positioned. The dead man's hands were wrapped around a bundle of papyrus scrolls, clutching them to his chest, as if they were more precious than life itself. Around the body, scattered like the remnants of a desperate last stand, were writing implements, reed pens, ink cakes, and fragments of limestone ostraca covered with hieratic script. This had not been a tomb prepared according to proper burial customs, but a prison where someone had been sealed alive with only his writing materials for company. Seneb had lived through enough political upheavals to recognize danger when he saw it. Rather than reporting the discovery immediately to the current overseer, a man whose loyalty to the Theban authorities was well known, the old mason quietly removed the body and its precious cargo to his own quarters. By lamplight, in the privacy of his small dwelling, he attempted to decipher what the dead man had considered worth dying for. The master mason's reading skills were limited, acquired through years of necessity rather than formal education, but he could make out enough to understand that these were not ordinary documents. Names that he recognized from the dark days of transition appeared repeatedly. High-ranking priests who had orchestrated the return to traditional ways, officials who had grown wealthy during the period of restoration, and military commanders who had somehow survived the purges that claimed so many of Akhenaten's supporters. One document, written in a hand that trembled with either fear or excitement, contained a list of locations throughout Amarna where additional evidence had been hidden. As Seneb read these carefully noted hiding places, he realized that the dead scribe had been trying to preserve proof of something so dangerous that his enemies had preferred to seal him alive rather than risk a public execution that might raise uncomfortable questions. Over the following weeks, working carefully and in secret, Seneb began to search the locations mentioned in the documents. Most had been thoroughly ransacked in the years following Amarna's abandonment, but in 3 places he found small caches of papyri that had escaped detection. The evidence they contained was explosive, detailed correspondence proving that the Amun priesthood had been systematically embezzling from royal treasuries, undermining military operations, and even providing intelligence to Egypt's enemies. But the most damning discovery was a letter bearing the personal seal of Amenemheb, the former second prophet of Amun, admitting that Akhenaten's death had not been natural. The pharaoh had been poisoned during a religious ceremony, the fatal dose hidden in the sacred bread offered to commemorate the god Aten. The murder had been carefully planned to appear as divine judgment against the heretical king, but the letter revealed it as cold-blooded assassination motivated by greed and the lust for power. Seneb understood that he possessed information that could shake the foundations of the current government. But he was also wise enough to know that direct confrontation with such powerful enemies would only result in his own death and the destruction of the evidence. Instead, he adopted a strategy that the murdered scribe might have admired for its careful subtlety. The old mason began to share selected portions of his discoveries with trusted friends, veterans who had served under Akhenaten, craftsmen who remembered the prosperity of the early years, merchants who had suffered under the corruption that followed. He spoke carefully, never revealing the full extent of what he knew, but gradually building a network of people who understood that the official version of recent history was built on lies and murder. The truth spread slowly, like water seeping through limestone, finding its way into conversations in taverns, workshops, and military barracks. Former soldiers compared notes about suspicious orders they had received during the transition period. Scribes in distant provinces began to notice discrepancies between official accounts and their own records. Even some priests, disgusted by the corruption they witnessed daily within the temples, began to question whether their God was truly being served by such treachery. The full revelation took years to unfold, and justice, when it came, was neither swift nor complete. Many of the original conspirators died of old age before their crimes could be exposed, taking their secrets to whatever judgment awaited them in the afterlife. But others faced disgrace, exile, or worse, as the scope of their betrayal became clear to those who mattered most, the people of Egypt who had suffered under their corrupt rule. Perhaps most importantly, the carefully preserved evidence began to change how thoughtful Egyptians viewed the reign of Akhenaten. The pharaoh who had been vilified as a mad heretic was gradually recognized as a tragic hero who had fought impossible odds to save his kingdom from internal enemies. His religious revolution, once seen as dangerous madness, was reinterpreted as a desperate attempt to break the power of a priestly establishment that had been systematically destroying Egypt from within. Khamenet's sacrifice had not been in vain. The young scribe who had died clutching proof of the truth had achieved something beyond his wildest dreams: the gradual rehabilitation of the pharaoh he had served and the exposure of the conspiracy that had murdered him. Though his name would never be recorded in the official histories, his courage had ensured that justice, however delayed, would ultimately prevail. In the end, the truth proved to be like the Nile itself. It might be dammed, diverted, or polluted, but eventually it would find its way to the sea. The conspiracy that had seemed so powerful, so untouchable, had been undone by the stubborn persistence of a dead man's testimony and the moral courage of those who chose to honor his sacrifice. If you enjoyed uncovering this hidden chapter of Egyptian history, let me know in the comments what other mysteries from the ancient world intrigue you most. Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories from the land of the pharaohs, where the desert sands conceal truths that can shake our understanding of the past. Some secrets are buried so deep that only time itself can bring them to light. But when they emerge, they remind us that even in the darkest times, there are always those willing to die for the truth.